Man risks life in flood to save dog, then walks away without a word. Asterisk. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the normally peaceful Riverside neighborhood into a disaster zone. What had started as a typical spring storm had escalated into the worst flooding the area had seen in over 50 years. The Clearwater River had burst its banks, sending torrents of muddy water rushing through streets that had never seen anything more threatening than the occasional puddle. Emergency sirens wailed continuously as rescue teams worked around the clock to evacuate residents from their homes. The water level had risen so quickly that many people had been caught completely off guard, forced to flee to their second floors or rooftops with nothing but the clothes on their backs. National Guard trucks rumbled through the deeper sections of the neighborhood, their massive tires cutting through water that reached nearly to their windows. It was in this chaos that the desperate barking began. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 83-year-old widow who had lived in the same house for 47 years, had been evacuated to the emergency shelter at the high school earlier that morning. In the panic and confusion of the rescue, she had been forced to leave behind her beloved golden retriever, Max, a 12-year-old dog who had been her constant companion since her husband's death. Max was trapped on the second floor of Mrs. Patterson's house, which was now surrounded by 8 feet of rapidly moving floodwater. The current was so strong that it had already swept away cars, mailboxes, and anything else that wasn't firmly anchored to the ground. The house itself was groaning under the pressure of the water, and emergency officials had declared the entire block too dangerous for rescue operations. "We can't risk human lives for a pet," Fire Chief Robert Martinez had told Mrs. Patterson at the shelter, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the current is too strong, and the house isn't stable. We have to focus on getting people to safety." Mrs. Patterson had collapsed into a plastic chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Max wasn't just a pet to her. He was family, the only living being who had been with her through her husband's illness, death, and the lonely years that followed. The thought of him trapped and terrified in that house, probably wondering why she had abandoned him, was more than she could bear. That's when he appeared at the shelter. A man in his 40s, tall and lean with graying hair and intense blue eyes, had been moving quietly through the emergency shelter, checking out evacuees and offering assistance where needed. He wore simple clothes, jeans, work boots, and a dark jacket that was already soaked from the rain, and carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. He had been listening to Mrs. Patterson's conversation with the fire chief, and when he heard her heartbroken sobs, he approached her with gentle determination. "Ma'am," he said quietly, kneeling beside her chair, "what's your dog's name?" Mrs. Patterson looked up through her tears, surprised that anyone would ask about Max when everyone else seemed to have written him off as a lost cause. "His name is Max," she whispered. "He's 12 years old, and he's all I have left in this world. He must be so scared, wondering why I left him." The stranger nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious but calm. "What floor is he on, and where in the house would he most likely be?" "The second floor, probably in my bedroom at the front of the house. That's where he always goes when he's frightened. There's a big window there that looks out onto the street." Mrs. Patterson's voice grew more hopeful as she realized this man was asking practical questions, not just offering empty sympathy. Fire Chief Martinez, who had been listening to the conversation, stepped forward with concern. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I have to advise against it. That area is completely flooded, the current is deadly, and the house could collapse at any moment." The stranger stood and faced the fire chief directly. "I understand the risks," he said simply, "but that dog is family to this woman, and family doesn't get left behind." "Look, I appreciate the sentiment," Chief Martinez replied, "but you're not trained for water rescue. You don't have the equipment, and you don't understand how dangerous these conditions are. I can't let you attempt something this reckless." The stranger's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had faced dangerous situations before. "Chief, with all due respect, you can't stop me. I'm not asking for permission, and I'm not asking for help. I'm just letting you know what I'm going to do." Before anyone could protest further, the stranger had turned back to Mrs. Patterson. "I'm going to bring Max back to you," he said with quiet confidence. "I need you to stay here and wait for us. Can you do that?" Mrs. Patterson grabbed his hand. With both of hers, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "Please be careful," she whispered. "I can't lose both of you." The stranger squeezed her hands gently. "You won't lose either of us," he promised. "Max is going to be fine." As he prepared to leave the shelter, several other evacuees had gathered around, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Word spread quickly through the crowded gymnasium that someone was going to attempt to rescue the trapped dog, and people began offering equipment, advice, and prayers. "Take my rope," offered Jim Bradley, a local contractor. "It's climbing rope, rated for heavy loads." "I've got a life jacket in my truck," called out Sarah Chun, a nurse who had been helping at the shelter. "It's not much, but it might help." The stranger accepted the rope gratefully, but declined the life jacket. "It'll just weigh me down," he explained. "I need to be able to move quickly in the water." As he headed toward the shelter's exit, Chief Martinez made one last attempt to dissuade him. "At least tell me your name," he said, in case we need to notify someone." The stranger paused at the door, rain already beginning to soak through his jacket as he stepped outside. "Just call me David," he said. "And Chief, have a boat ready at the corner of Maple and 3rd. That's where I'll bring Max out." David disappeared into the storm, leaving behind a shelter full of people who were now glued to the windows, trying to catch glimpses of his progress through the driving rain. Chief Martinez, despite his professional objections to the rescue attempt, found himself coordinating with his team to position a rescue boat at the location David had specified. "This is insane," muttered Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, the chief's second in command. "That guy's going to get himself killed, and probably for nothing. The dog might already be dead." But Chief Martinez was studying the topographical maps of the flooded area, and he was beginning to realize that David had chosen his exit strategy carefully. The corner of Maple and 3rd was on slightly higher ground, where the current would be less severe and a boat could safely operate. "He knows what he's doing," the chief said quietly. "Whoever this David is, he's not just some random good Samaritan. He understands water rescue." Meanwhile, David was making his way through the flooded streets with the methodical precision of someone who had navigated dangerous waters before. He moved along the edges of buildings where the current was weakest, using submerged cars and debris as stepping stones when necessary. The water was cold and murky, filled with debris that could easily knock a person unconscious or trap them underwater. As he approached Mrs. Patterson's house, David could hear Max's barking, growing louder and more desperate. The dog had clearly been calling for help for hours, and his voice was becoming hoarse from the effort. The house itself was partially submerged, with water reaching almost to the second-floor windows. The structure was visibly unstable, leaning slightly to one side as the foundation was undermined by the rushing water. David studied the situation carefully, calculating angles and risks with the practiced eye of someone who had faced similar challenges before. The front of the house was taking the full force of the current, making it impossible to approach directly. But the back of the house was partially sheltered by a large oak tree that was still standing, creating a small eddy where the water was. Calmer, he made his way around to the back of the house, swimming when necessary, but mostly wading through chest-deep water that threatened to knock him off his feet with every step. The rope Jim Bradley had given him was secured around his waist, with the other end tied to a sturdy fence post that was still above water-level Dot. When David reached the back of the house, he found what he was looking for: a second-floor window. That was partially open, probably left that way for ventilation before the flood hit. The window was about 10 feet above the current water level, requiring him to climb up the side of the house using whatever handholds he could find. The exterior of the house was slick with rain and flood debris, making every grip treacherous. David moved slowly and deliberately, testing each handhold before trusting his weight to it. Below him, the floodwater continued to rise, and he could feel the house shifting slightly with each surge of the current. Dot, as he climbed, Max's barking became even more frantic. The dog had clearly heard someone approaching and was desperately trying to guide his rescuer to the right location. David could hear the animal scratching at what was probably a bedroom door, trying to get closer to the sound of potential rescue. David finally reached the partially open window and carefully worked it open wider, mindful that any sudden movement could destabilize the already precarious structure. As he climbed through the window, he found himself in what was clearly Mrs. Patterson's bedroom, now partially flooded with about 2 feet of water that had seeped up through the floorboards. Max was there, standing on the bed with his golden fur matted and wet, his tail wagging frantically despite his obvious exhaustion and fear. The moment he saw David, the dog began whimpering with relief, as if he understood that help had finally arrived. "Hey there, Max," David said softly, extending his hand for the dog to sniff. "Your mom sent me to bring you home. Are you ready to get out of here?" Max immediately jumped from the bed into the water, swimming over to David and pressing against his legs with desperate affection. The dog was clearly dehydrated and exhausted, but he seemed uninjured and alert. David quickly assessed the situation, realizing that getting Max out of the house would be significantly more challenging than getting in had been. The window was too high for Max to jump through, and David couldn't safely carry a 60-pound dog while climbing down the exterior of an unstable house. He needed a different plan. David explored the second floor quickly, looking for alternative escape routes. The front staircase was completely underwater, and the back staircase was partially collapsed. But he found what he needed in Mrs. Patterson's bedroom closet: several heavy blankets and a sturdy laundry basket. Working quickly, David fashioned a makeshift harness using the rope and blankets, creating a secure but comfortable way to lower Max from the window to the water below. The dog seemed to understand that David was trying to help him, remaining calm and cooperative, even as David fitted the improvised harness around his body. "Okay, boy," David said, lifting Max to the window. "This might be scary, but I need you to trust me. We're going to get you down to the water, and then we're going swimming together." Max looked into David's eyes with the absolute trust that only dogs can give, then allowed himself to be lowered slowly from the window. David controlled the descent carefully, making sure Max didn't swing into the side of the house or get tangled in debris floating in the water. Once Max was safely in the water, David quickly climbed down to join him. The dog was a strong swimmer, but the current was challenging even for him, and David could see that Max was already tired from hours of stress and fear. David secured the rope around both himself and Max, creating a safety line that would prevent them from being separated if the current proved too strong. Then, with Max swimming beside him, he began the dangerous journey back to the evacuation point. The return trip was even more treacherous than the approach had been. The water level had continued to rise, and debris was flowing downstream at an alarming rate. David had to constantly adjust their route to avoid floating cars, fallen trees, and other hazards that could easily crush them both. Max, despite his exhaustion, seemed to understand the gravity of their situation and swam with determination beside his rescuer. Several times, David had to pull the dog out of the way of dangerous debris. And once he had to dive underwater with Max to avoid a floating propane tank that could have exploded on impact. As they approached the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, David could see the rescue boat that Chief Martinez had positioned there, along with a crowd of people who had gathered to watch the rescue attempt. News of David's mission had spread throughout the shelter and beyond, and local news crews had arrived to document what many were calling either act of heroism or a reckless suicide attempt. The final 50 yards were the most dangerous part of the journey. The current was strongest at the intersection of the 2 flooded streets, and David had to time their approach carefully to avoid being swept past the rescue boat. He could see Chief Martinez and his team ready with throw ropes and life preservers. But he knew that if he miscalculated their approach, there might not be a second chance. "Come on, Max," David said, his voice steady despite the physical strain of fighting the current for over an hour. "We're almost home. Your mom is waiting. For you." With a final surge of effort, David angled their approach to intersect with the rescue boat just as it moved forward to meet them. Strong hands reached down to pull Max from the water first, then hauled David aboard just as his strength was beginning to fail. "Jesus Christ," breathed Lieutenant Rodriguez as she helped David into the boat. "I can't believe you actually pulled that off. Are you okay? Is the dog okay?" David was breathing heavily, but seemed uninjured. Max was shaking with cold and exhaustion, but was clearly alive and alert, his tail wagging weakly as he realized he was safe. "We're both fine," David said simply. "Let's get Max back to Mrs. Patterson." The boat ride back to the evacuation point took only a few minutes, but word of the successful rescue had already reached the shelter. When David and Max arrived, they were greeted by a crowd of cheering evacuees and emergency workers who had been following the rescue attempt on radio. Communications. Mrs. Patterson was waiting at the dock, tears streaming down her face as she saw Max being lifted from the rescue boat. The moment the dog saw her, he began barking with joy, his exhaustion forgotten in the excitement of being reunited with his beloved owner. "Max!" "Oh, Max!" Mrs. Patterson cried, falling to her knees as the dog rushed into her arms. "I thought I'd lost you forever." The reunion was emotional for everyone present. Hardened emergency workers found themselves wiping away tears as they watched the elderly woman and her dog embrace, both of them trembling with relief and joy. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, and several people began calling David a hero. But when Mrs. Patterson looked up to thank her dog's rescuer, David was nowhere to be found. "Where did he go?" she asked Chief Martinez, who was scanning the crowd with confusion. "Where's David? I need to thank him." Chief Martinez looked around in bewilderment. Just moments earlier, David had been standing right beside the rescue boat, dripping wet and breathing hard from his ordeal. Now, somehow, he had vanished completely, leaving behind only the rope he had used and a small puddle of floodwater where he had been standing. "I don't understand," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, shaking her head. "He was right here. How does someone just disappear like that?" The search for David began immediately, but it quickly became apparent that he had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. Emergency workers checked every corner of the evacuation area, questioned every witness, and even reviewed the news footage that had been shot during the rescue. But David seemed to have simply melted away into the crowd. What made his disappearance even more puzzling was that nobody could provide a clear description of what he looked like beyond the basic details Mrs. Patterson had noticed. Some witnesses remembered him as taller, others as shorter. Some said his hair was brown, others insisted it was gray. The only consistent details were his calm demeanor and his obvious expertise in water rescue. Chief Martinez launched an official investigation, not because any crime had been committed, but because he wanted to recognize David's heroism and ensure he received proper medical attention after his dangerous rescue mission. The investigation revealed something that left everyone even more confused. There was no record of anyone named David checking into the emergency shelter that day. "It's impossible," Chief Martinez told the local news reporter who was covering the story. "Everyone who enters the shelter has to sign in for safety and security reasons. We have a complete list of every evacuee, every volunteer, and every emergency worker who was there today. There's no David on any of our lists." The security cameras at the shelter provided another piece of the puzzle that only deepened the mystery. The footage clearly showed David talking to Mrs. Patterson and accepting the rope from Jim Bradley. But when he left the building, the cameras seemed to malfunction for exactly the duration of his exit. When the footage resumed, there was no sign of him anywhere. Mrs. Patterson became obsessed with finding David, spending hours each day calling local hospitals, police stations, and rescue organizations, hoping to track down the man who had saved Max's life. She placed advertisements in newspapers, posted on social media, and even hired a private investigator, but no one could find any trace of David's existence. "It's like he was an angel," Mrs. Patterson told reporters 3 weeks after the flood. "He appeared exactly when Max needed him most, risked his own life to save my dog, and then disappeared without asking for anything in return. I've never experienced anything like it." The story of David's mysterious rescue became legendary in the community and beyond. Local churches began holding special services to honor the guardian angel of the flood, while skeptics insisted there had to be a logical explanation for his disappearance. Paranormal investigators arrived to study the case, and the story was featured on several national television programs about unexplained phenomena. 6 months later, Mrs. Patterson and Max had settled into a new home on higher ground, far from any flood zones. Max had fully recovered from his ordeal and seemed to have no lasting trauma from his experience, though Mrs. Patterson noticed that he would sometimes sit by the window and stare out at the street, as if he was watching for someone. On the anniversary of the flood, Mrs. Patterson returned to the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, now completely rebuilt and showing no signs of the devastation that had occurred there. She brought flowers and a handwritten note thanking David for his incredible act of courage and kindness. As she placed the flowers by the street sign, she noticed a man in work clothes walking a golden retriever puppy past the memorial site. The man looked familiar somehow, though she couldn't quite place where she might have seen him before. When he noticed her flowers and note, he paused and smiled. "Beautiful dog," he said, nodding toward Max, who was sitting calmly beside Mrs. Patterson. "Looks like he's been through some adventures." Mrs. Patterson studied the man's face, feeling a strange sense of recognition. "Yes," she said slowly. "He was rescued from a flood a year ago by a very brave man. I never got to thank him properly." The stranger's smile grew warmer. "I'm sure he knows how grateful you are," he said gently. "Sometimes the best thanks is just living well and taking good care of the ones we love." Before Mrs. Patterson could respond, the man had continued walking, his puppy trotting happily beside him. She watched them disappear around the corner, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard him whistle a tune that sounded exactly like the song her late husband used to hum when he was working in their garden. Max barked once, softly, and wagged his tail as he watched the stranger walk away, almost as if he was saying goodbye to an old friend. If this incredible story of selfless courage and mysterious heroism has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that prove angels walk among us every day. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join our community of believers in the extraordinary power of human compassion and divine intervention.